Hi everybody, welcome to Story Time with Lissette, and today's story is called The Spinster's Marriage. Now, I wrote this story back in 2018 after watching a documentary about a young girl in Europe who was a servant girl and came to work for a family. And an indiscretion, she ended up having a baby, and the family she lived in deplorable conditions, for having a baby. The family did not take care of her, ended up kicking her out because she had this baby and the baby had no father. So it was just a terrible situation. I watched this documentary and I was very disappointed to find out that this happened to this young lady, even though it was years ago. So I wanted to write of a fictional character. Her name is Lydia. Lydia also was a servant girl that comes out of an abusive household when she was a servant. And she ends up buying her own cottage. And now we know in those days, back in the 1800s, especially in England, women were not allowed to hold their own deeds to a house. But this woman did have her own deed. She ends up hiring different gardeners that work in her home to help her take care of her garden. But she falls in love with one particular gardener, and she just falls in love with him. He goes on an undisclosed journey, and she's trying to draw him back to her because she misses him so much, to just find out why he's been gone so long. Let's go on and jump into this story. If you want to go on ahead and watch this video later and just go on ahead and get yourself a cup of tea or coffee, maybe some crumb cake, maybe some nice candles with classical music, this is definitely one of those stories. I hope you enjoy. The Spinster's Marriage. As Lydia sat in her chair, wearing a printed house dress with a hem partially touching the ground, she poured herself a glass of cranberry cordial, while staring out the window watching the cattails dance upon the fields. Lydia thought only of her handsome Mr. Pembroke. Mr. Pembroke was to be desired, a handsome but gentle fellow that left 3 months earlier on a secret journey that he did not disclose to Lydia. Lydia thought his only memory of her was as a spinster, a nice lady who had offered him some work in her garden. Her heart was touched with soft agony as she longed for him to return so she could gaze upon the beauty of his face and the softness of his words. Mr. Pembroke was a tan-colored man, tall with the body frame of a hard worker. His eyes were brown and his teeth were as white as beautiful doves. Lydia knew that she was of no particular beauty. She loved her sweets. Her curly hair and her freckles were her most inspiring attributes, so she thought. At age 30, she was shunned by those who thought her singleness was an embarrassment to all of her acquaintances. She wanted to feel the love of Mr. Sweet Pembroke. Lydia stood up from her chair and walked over to the kitchen, walking as she had been sitting for weeks, forgetting the time that had gone by. Lydia decided she should bake a cider cake. Lydia remembered baking cider cakes as she watched Mr. Pembroke and other gardeners working in the garden during the toil of the summer's heat. Lydia took out her wooden bowl and thought, I would draw Mr. Pembroke near, and he would smell the cider of my cake and come near to my door. He would then realize that I have not forgotten my sweet gardener. When he enters the door, he will see the love in my eyes and look past the mask of my wrinkles and just attend to the beauty of my scars. He will love me and ask me to marry him. With excitement, Lydia prepared the cider cake and placed it in her clay oven. The excitement of his return made her think of marriage. Mr. Pembroke will be here soon, she thought to herself, taking off her apron while washing her hands, as to not realize that he was even gone. I will find my lace gown, she said, knowing no one was hearing her. Lydia's gown was an old lace dress she hid away long ago in her attic to avoid the memories of past hurts, which were almost unrecognizable, as if the thought of marrying Mr. Pembroke erased any past history that existed. Lydia found the dress tucked away in a trunk. she had used when she had moved around back in her servant days when she worked for Mrs. Winfield. Mrs. Winfield beat Lydia and paid her very little in shillings. However, Lydia managed to save money to live modestly alone in her fine cottage. England at the time was full of servants who worked for very low wages. Mrs. Winfield paid Lydia 20 shillings, which equaled to 18 cents a week. As Lydia's mind wandered into the sad times of her life, she thought maybe it was meant to happen just so I could meet Mr. Pembroke. Lydia pulled the dress softly out of the old wooden trunk. The lock on the trunk was in no working condition, but it helped block out the past memories. Lydia tried on the dress and looked in the faded mirror, noticing her beauty was enhanced by the draping lace. Lydia remembered the cake and ran down to the kitchen while holding up the side of her laced gown. She opened the clay oven to realize the cake was in its great conformity. "What a relief," she said. "I must place better attention to my baking if I want to obtain Mr. Pembroke back." Lydia walked out to the garden and picked beautiful wildflowers that had not been attended to since Mr. Pembroke left on his journey. Lydia placed the flowers on the center of the table as to dress the cider cake in its beautiful splendor. The cider cake was finally ready. The aroma filled the house, and Lydia could actually smell the fall seeping into the small cottage. Mr. Pembroke should be arriving soon. He will smell the cider cake, and I will no longer be a spinster. He will know I was thinking of him, that my every moment was engulfed in his handsome image and kind character. Night turned into day, and weeks turned into months, and Mr. Pembroke never came to the door. As the months turned into years, Lydia's heartache turned into a sweet memory. Her lace dress once again embracing the inside of the old trunk. One day, Lydia heard a knock at the door. When she opened the door, it was Mr. Cummings, the postman. With an astonished look on her face, wondering why would a postman come to my door, knowing that she had no affiliations or family. "Mr. Cummings, what brings you here today?" asked Lydia. With a look of empathy on Mr. Cummings' face, he said, holding an envelope out in his hand, "Miss Lydia, I have a letter for you." Lydia, with a look of patience embracing her face, as if to be hiding her wanting to hurry into the house and read that letter. "Thank you, Mr. Cummings," said Lydia. While slightly placing her hand in her pocket, Lydia pulled out 15 shillings and paid Mr. Cummings for his day's travel. Lydia hurried into the house as she watched Mr. Cummings ride off on his carriage through the window. Lydia sat on her familiar chair she had sat in for so many years, waiting for Mr. Pembroke, pouring herself a glass of cherry cordial that was sitting on the wooden table. Lydia began to read the letter, and the letter read, "My dear Lydia, as I lay here on my dying bed, there's something I've been wanting to tell you for years. I love you. I was so saddened to know that your love for me was not returned in the same manner. I came for you 5 years ago. I was approaching back after successfully seeking work and longing to ask you for your hand in marriage. As I was headed toward your cottage, I noticed a smell of cider cake and remembered that you had baked cider cakes for the gardeners. I knew then that you had hired another gardener and that he had visited upon your beauty and would marry you and not want to leave your side once he realized that you were the sweetest lady he had laid eyes upon. I was too ashamed to knock on your door and be confronted with an undesirable situation. You see, from the moment I first saw you, I fell in love with you. Now I write you to say goodbye and tell you my heart's fondest memories are of you baking that cider cake while watching me work in the heat of the summer. I will forever love you, my darling Lydia. Yours forever, Mr. Pembroke." Lydia finished reading the letter. Surprisingly, feeling a bittersweet comfort, Lydia realized that all along she had obtained the love of Mr. Pembroke, and that he was truly the love of her heart. With a sweet expression on her face, she finally realized that she was indeed a married spinster. So, this story takes place in the 1890s, a time when many rich people had servants that worked very hard labor. Some servants came from poor houses. Some rich people did not treat servants right. Many women were considered spinsters at the age of 24. I wanted to show the side of a woman who was a servant at one point enduring abuse, yet managed to own her own home and fall in love. At the end, she realized that she was very much loved by Mr. Pembroke. Women owning their own houses or a deed was also not heard of in the 1800s. This story shows an independence of Lydia's yet poor, but still managed to hire a gardener. So even though she didn't get paid a whole lot, even though she went through some very hard times, even though Mr. Pembroke went through some hard times, he went on that journey to find work. He didn't want to let her know. Maybe he thought if he would let her know that he was going to find work, she would replace him with another gardener. That could have been his insecurity and his fear. And when he came to the house, he realized, oh, she's making cider cake. She's already hired someone. And he left. Would you have knocked on that door if you were Mr. Pembroke? Would you have made that cider cake if you were Lydia? I don't know. Would I have made that cider cake? I might have. I might have wanted to make the cider cake. But it also shows a vulnerable part of herself. That she believed she was no particular beauty, but she really was beautiful. He really thought she was beautiful, but to her, she felt she wasn't. And sometimes we go through those insecurities in life, don't we? We feel like we may not be good enough for a job, or we have to please people to get them to like us instead of just being ourselves. But Mr. Pembroke waited till his dying day to send her this letter. Does he truly die? Because it doesn't really say. It says, I'm on my dying bed. But he could have gotten better. We'll find out soon. So I hope you enjoy the spinster's marriage. I hope you enjoy this story. And I hope that I see you again. Have a wonderful day and God bless.